Well, there's a lot of serious philosophy here, but we're going to break it down simple. Howdy, I'm Dr. Reed here at The Political Animal, and today we're going to tackle the following question. When and why did people start thinking that values are subjective? So I bet you've probably seen this kind of subjectivity before. Have you ever heard anyone say, live your truth? Have you ever been corrected for saying that some activity or commitment of another person is wrong? If so, you were probably told, this isn't a question of right and wrong. It's only a question of what makes someone happy. Have you ever seen two people in a moral disagreement completely give up on rationally resolving the disagreement? Maybe they agreed to disagree, or maybe they moved on to shouting and a fistfight. Have you ever seen someone avoid a debate over a moral issue by saying that morals are a matter of opinion rather than fact? I bet you have. And I bet it sounded wrong to you. Even if you couldn't explain why, it probably left a bad taste in your mouth. And yet these days, we're all expected to say that kind of subjective stuff. Just look at politicians, celebrities, people in the media, on the news or daytime television. Look at how they talk. Nothing is off the table. Anything can be okay if it makes you feel good or if it feels authentic. And in response, you might wonder, well, am I crazy? Am I the only one who thinks that there are good and bad ways to live? That not everything is on the table? Or has the world gone crazy? If only someone could make a video explaining when and why and how the world got so crazy. Well, I'm here to tell you today that no, you're not the one who's crazy. I mean, you might be, but not for this reason. This way of talking about values as subjective is quite new, and I'm going to tell you part of the story of how we got here, with some help from the book After Virtue. So yes, today in the modern world, values are treated as subjective. If you should find yourself in the modern university, you'll hear professors talk about the fact-value divide as though there cannot be any facts about values. As though there's no truth about values. So according to the modern ethos, what ultimately counts as a good or bad life depends almost entirely upon the subjective preferences of the person. But it was not always so. In the past, values were thought to be grounded in something objective, something beyond the individual's subjective preferences. Something objective, or better, transcendent, a transcendent idea of the good. Ever wonder how we got from there to here? If so, you're not alone. In 1981, the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre wrote the book After Virtue, in part to explain how we went from objective conceptions of the good life to modern subjectivity. And while some today might view that transition as progress, MacIntyre describes it as a calamity. So the reason you wonder whether you're crazy or whether society's crazy is because, according to MacIntyre, you're living in a dystopia. Literally, he compares our situation to a dystopian sci-fi novel. Evaluative language and how to use it has really fallen apart, and the social world around you really is clueless about how to live. So that's the good news. You're not crazy. So here's where we're going from here. In the rest of this video, I'm going to introduce a key part of MacIntyre's story of how we got to modern subjectivity. MacIntyre explains that the transition point is the intellectual revolution called the Enlightenment. And going into the Enlightenment, there was a shared and objective framework for moral thought, but coming out of it, there was not. And MacIntyre identifies the pivotal moment on the path to subjectivity as when the Enlightenment philosophers sought a new foundation to justify the ethical life. They wanted a new foundation to replace the old one. And I wouldn't be making this video today if they'd succeeded. Well, MacIntyre argues that their failure to find a new foundation for ethics led to the widespread view today that all values are subjective. So first, we're going to talk about the Enlightenment, and don't worry, I'll define it for you. And the Enlightenment project to justify the ethical life. Then we'll look at how 3 Enlightenment philosophers tried 3 different ways to do it. And finally, we'll see how their failure paves the way for the view that values are subjective. To really understand the story, we have to talk about the Enlightenment. So, what is the Enlightenment? Well, Enlightenment is a term thrown around a lot. If you hang around humanities departments, everyone's talking about the Enlightenment. And some people think of it as the time in history when everything started to get better, and other people are going to blame it for everything that's wrong with the world today. Okay, so what is the Enlightenment? Do you know? Like, could you actually define it without Googling? So relax, I'm going to give you a definition, and so now you can sound smart at parties. So here is a short first pass definition. The Enlightenment, sorry, let me do it in my definition voice. The Enlightenment was a period of intellectual revolution in Europe from the mid-1600s to the late 1700s. During this time, science, medicine, politics, religion all undergo revolutions, but the intellectual movement is driven by philosophers. All right, so that's for free. Now, if you really want to impress, you can go look up why the Enlightenment is dated as ending usually in either 1789 or 1815. Why? Why those 2 years? Now, it can help you to locate the Enlightenment in time, to think of it as the successor to the Renaissance. But really, it represents a shift away from the Renaissance. For our purposes today, we only need to know one major theme of the Enlightenment, and that is the transformation of how European intellectuals look at the quest for knowledge. So, under a medieval Renaissance model, broadly speaking, the general assumption was that truth was to be found in the great thinkers of antiquity, great philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians from the old Greco-Roman world. And the medievals looked up to the thinkers of the classical age. That's why they called them classical. And they saw them as authorities. So as late as the Renaissance, if you wanted to learn astronomy, you read from the great Greek astronomer from the Roman Empire, Ptolemy, who lived over 1,000 years earlier. Similarly, if you wanted to learn about anatomy and medicine, you read the great Greek physician, Galen. If you're interested in math, well, you read Eudoxus. Want to know about physics or biology? Well, then you should read Aristotle, and so on. Well, the Enlightenment ended all of this. Instead of looking back to the past at authorities, they sought to surpass the ancients and discover truths for themselves. So the Enlightenment spirit is like, well, don't settle for Ptolemy. Look at the stars through a telescope for yourself, right? Don't just trust Galen. Go cut up some cadavers. And similarly, go and do some experiments instead of just trusting Aristotle's physics. So the Enlightenment aims to base knowledge not in authoritative texts from the past, but only on what can be demonstrated through one of two things. Either one, through some rational argument from axioms, using geometry as a model, or through an empirical investigation of the observable world. Enlightenment thinkers relished discrediting old authorities. Think about Ptolemy's view that the sun revolves around the earth. Galileo is a hero. He's an Enlightenment hero for discrediting that older view. Now, for today, we're interested in ethics. There are two examples of this discrediting of old authorities that are relevant for the topic of the day. First, there is the Enlightenment rejection of Aristotle's teleological interpretation of nature. Second, there is the Enlightenment's rejection of the Bible's status as revelation from God. So one major victory for Enlightenment thinkers was replacing the Aristotelian interpretation of nature with a mechanical interpretation. Aristotle's physics were based on a theory of nature that was teleological. That is, Aristotle thought all motion was the striving of a natural object to reach its natural completion or resting point. And Aristotle thought everything in nature was purposive and move towards its final goal, or telos. Well, Newton gives us a replacement physics that is essentially applied geometry and relies only on mechanical laws. Now, the second major victory of the Enlightenment that we need to think about today was undermining confidence in the Bible as divine revelation. Prior to the Enlightenment, educated elites placed their trust in the Bible, and it was used in public debate on matters of great importance. Well, this trust was diminished by the introduction of biblical criticism and the rise of philosophical systems that rejected miracles. So the Dutch philosopher Spinoza famously contributed to both, arguing God could not act against the laws of nature. Well, that means no miracles, and that means no special revelation. Hence, the Bible would have no divine authority. It's just a book written by men. And in response, many intellectuals became deists at this time. So deists hang on to belief in God, but they deny that God ever acts in history or outside the laws of nature. There's no revelation from God. And importantly, that means all revealed religions are false. So how did the Enlightenment lose the foundations for ethics? So MacIntyre thinks there was a solid framework for ethics that justified the moral life before the Enlightenment. And so in this section, I'm going to describe it, and I'll give you a chance to see if you can figure out what happened. So the framework I'll describe is scholastic natural law, as understood by medieval Christian philosophers. Think of Aquinas, or if you've read a lot, think of Suarez. Philosophers from the medieval period viewed natural law as having two aspects that made the ethical life choice-worthy, okay? That made the ethical life choice-worthy, okay? So first, the natural law has an indicative aspect. It shows or reveals the best and happiest mode of life. And central to the best kind of life are the virtues of character. So if you want to live well and flourish, you'll need to cultivate the virtues. And insofar as you're rational, then you're going to live a virtuous life. Think of the indicative aspect of the natural law as a counsel, advice, a counsel of prudence, advice for living well. Second, the natural law has a prescriptive aspect. It represents God's command to live well. So for those of us, like myself, not rational enough to seek the virtuous life on our own, well, God commands it. And threats of divine sanction provide, let's call it, additional motivation to live according to the virtues. Now, to put these together into the natural law, I suggest thinking of it like this. Think of it as going to see your dentist as a kid. So, what happens at the end of the appointment, right? Like he's messed with your teeth, and then the dentist sits down, like you've learned to respect him, bringer of pain. He sits you down and he gives you a little talk. And he's actually pretty nice. The dentist says, look, if you want healthy teeth and gums, so I don't have to do all this scraping and drilling and stuff, you need to floss every day. And so the dentist was showing you the kind of activity that leads to dental health, right? The dentist is giving you advice. He's giving you counsel. Well, this is like the indicative aspect of the natural law. But then you got home and you talked to your mom. And your mom did not say if. She just said floss your teeth. There were no hypotheticals. There were no conditions. She was not counseling you, right? She was commanding you, right? She wasn't giving you advice. She was giving you a categorical command. So your mom's commands were like the prescriptive aspect of the natural law. Now notice, it's the same thing. The dentist and your mom, like the content is the same. They're both telling you the same thing. Floss your teeth, right? Yeah, floss, brush, all that stuff. Use mouthwash. The dentist, though, is advising, your mom is commanding. The indicative and prescriptive aspects of the natural law work together. The indicative aspect shows you what the right way to live is, gives you a rational explanation. And it does this because it's indicating or revealing your natural telos or function. And this function is what grounds ethical truths. Now, telos, that's another big word. And we're going to come across it more than once. But it has to do with the purpose and function of a thing. And it turns out that many of our concepts, many are functional concepts. And MacIntyre will emphasize that functional concepts make evaluations factual. So as an example, think of a farmer, like think of one. How do you know what makes someone a good farmer as opposed to a bad one? Well, a farmer has a function, growing and harvesting crops. So you consider the function, and then you look at this farmer in front of you, you evaluate him, and you see whether or not he performs this function well or not. Well, if he fails to grow and harvest crops, he's probably not a very good farmer. Well, the indicative aspect of the natural law reveals the facts about living well by relying on function. The prescriptive aspect reinforces the indicative in case the rationality of living well isn't enough for you. So, divine command in the context of covenant with the Creator is going to create an overriding reason to do what's right. So, do you see what's happened? How the Enlightenment lost it? Well, when Aristotle's teleological theory of nature goes, there goes the foundation of the natural law. Now think about divine command. If God actually commands us, okay, but when and where does God do this? Well, the old answer was the Bible. Well, they've taken that away too. So if we embrace deism, then the answer is never and nowhere. As revealed religion loses its authority, so does the natural law. So this should clear up how the Enlightenment undermined the foundations for morality, and thus why the Enlightenment thinkers are now seeking new foundations for the ethical life. So the Enlightenment gets rid of the foundations of morality. And then MacIntyre says this leads to the Enlightenment challenge. The Enlightenment has to find new foundations to ground the moral life. Well, there's a lot of serious philosophy here, but we're going to break it down simple. So I'm going to recommend you think of the Enlightenment challenge like a cooking game show, like something on the Food Network, like Chopped or Ready, Steady, Cook. So this game show is a cooking contest. And the contestants are all trying to make the same basic dish, but none of them are allowed access to the normal ingredients. Instead, they have to make the ingredients from scratch, using only what's available in a kitchen on set. So if they need mayonnaise, they got to make it from what's around. You got to find an egg, or I got to find some vinegar. If they sneak in a jar of Hellmann's, they're disqualified. If they need salsa, they got to make it. Better find some cilantro, right? If they bring in a jar of salsa, disqualified. Now, to understand the analogy, think of the Enlightenment and its ideas as the kitchen where the competition happens. The challenge is find a new foundation for ethics to justify the received moral rules. That means that the challenge is to justify the traditional inherited moral rules. So think about that, justify. What does MacIntyre mean when he says they're trying to justify the moral rules? Well, what he means is the ethical life isn't easy. Why should anyone embrace the ethical life over a much more fun life of self-indulgence? The challenge is to find a framework that provides powerful reasons for why the ethical life is superior. It will reveal the authority backing the ethical life. Because remember, we lost our two authorities with the natural law. Well, MacIntyre will also stress that this challenge is conservative. The goal is to justify the received norms and rules, not to reform or replace them with something new. So contrast this with thinkers like Rousseau, Marx, Freud. They're part of a different project. The Enlightenment thinkers that we're discussing are all conservative. The moral norms and rules to justify include things like promising, marital fidelity, property rights, truth-telling, and honest dealing. So the problem isn't that the Enlightenment doesn't like the traditional moral rules. It's trying to preserve those. But the issue is it wants to get them differently. So the question is, what ingredients are lying around in the kitchen? Well, the restricted ingredients should be relatively clear. Our contestants can't justify morality by appealing to divine command, nor can they justify morality by appealing to teleological human nature or a functional understanding of well-being. Okay? So there's no natural telos, there's no divine revelation in the kitchen. And similarly, a contestant cannot use any underived or unexplained normative principles. They have to make everything from scratch. The goal is to explain the source of authority for the moral life. So what ingredients can the contestants use? Well, all they can use, all that's sitting there in the Enlightenment kitchen, is human nature as we empirically observe it. So no functional or teleological interpretations, no transcendent human nature, just regular, boring old humans as we find them. And authority for the ethical life must be found among the everyday motivations of humans. Well, what would those be? Well, humans are motivated by various desires and emotions. We act because we fear, because we're in love and out of anger. That's acting from emotions. We act out of a desire for food, for comfort, for recognition. And we also act for reasons as part of long-term projects and commitments. And sometimes we do activities for the fun or excitement they bring. So some clear candidates emerge as potential sources of authority. There's reason, the emotions, and the desire for pleasure. So to summarize the challenge, our contestants must answer why anyone should embrace the life of the virtues, the moral life. Explain where the authority of the ethical life comes from. If their recipe leads to something inedible, well, they lose. If they bring in an already made ingredient, they lose. Let's meet the contestants. Most of them are Enlightenment thinkers. There's Diderot from France. He's a famous encyclopedist. There's David Hume from Scotland. He's a famous philosopher. And there's Immanuel Kant. He's from Prussia. Very famous philosopher. And another guy, he's not an Enlightenment thinker, but he's going to be important later on, is Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher. Okay, he's not quite from the Enlightenment, but MacIntyre thinks that it's in Kierkegaard that we really understand the implications. Now, our contestants' challenge is to ground and justify the authority of the ethical life. But the catch is they have to do this by appealing to some source of motivation in human nature we observe operating in everyday life. And each of the contestants has chosen a different ingredient from the Enlightenment kitchen. Diderot has chosen pleasure, Hume emotions, and Kant is going with reason. Remember, they can't make use of any underived source of authority or derived from outside these aspects of human nature. So let's see how they do. We'll start with Diderot. Pleasure. Well, Diderot is going to try and ground the moral life in the desire for pleasure. Now, that might sound strange to us at first, right? But this is actually a very respectable strategy, right? Diderot is just going straight for the prize. Even though we may not ordinarily associate morality with pleasure, here's the thing about pleasure. No one doubts its power to motivate. Everyone's interested in pleasure, right? Everyone is interested in doing things that are pleasing. This is so true that the life of pleasure is often seen as the great rival to the ethical life. So if we can turn pleasure and make it switch sides and work for the ethical life, that's like the Holy Grail. So Diderot starts off strong, looking to pleasure, and he has a point about the connection between the ethical life and pleasure. He thinks if we consider the pleasures that we can sustain long term, it does look like the ethical life helps us sustain them. Many moral rules have the character of delayed gratification, and delayed gratification is part of a life that can yield a lot of pleasure over the long haul. So moral rules could in fact be justified by their utility for long-term pleasure. The problem for Diderot emerges when we consider that pleasures can conflict, right? We might be confronted by two different prospects for pleasure: an immediate pleasure that requires breaking a moral rule, and a long-term pleasure that requires observing a moral rule. So how do we pick? How do we pick which pleasure to pursue? Now, if Diderot is going to justify the ethical life, he has to ensure that here the long-term pleasure wins. But what if, as often is the case, the immediate pleasure is more appealing than the long-term pleasure? This is where Diderot runs into trouble. There is no principle internal to the pursuit of pleasure that will determine that the long-term pleasure reliably wins over the immediate. I mean, often we find the immediate pleasure far more desirable. So how then can Diderot tip the scales for long-term pleasures and morality? Well, MacIntyre notes that in other works, Diderot distinguishes between natural and corrupt desires. He says we should develop and encourage the natural and not the corrupt. And that sounds reasonable. It sounds reasonable to me. But wait, remember our rules? Nothing internal to desires and pleasure makes this distinction for Diderot. He's bringing in an external criterion that he's not derived from within pleasure. So he's using a pre-made ingredient from the store, and he didn't make it from scratch. So he's broken the rules of the challenge. No underived principles. Okay, so let's see how Hume does. Now, Hume has a very sophisticated account of the origin of moral judgment, and I can't do it justice here. So I'm just going to give you the basic overview. Like Diderot, Hume is going to base morality in the non-rational part of the soul, desires and emotions. And like Diderot, Hume thinks that concern for long-term pleasure generally justifies the moral life. And Hume also recognizes there are cases where doing what's right does not clearly serve long-term interest at all. Hume's question then is, how can we be sufficiently motivated to do what's just when the prospect for pleasure is clearly on the side of injustice? Well, Hume appeals to a certain kind of negative emotion that comes from conscience, and he thinks this motive is sufficient to override the prospect of pleasure. This is the sense of duty. Now, where does Hume get this notion of conscience? Right? Remember the rules. He's got to derive all of his principles from scratch. And it turns out you don't have to tell Hume the rules. He knows. And so Hume gives a really incredible account of the origins of conscience, entirely in naturalistic and mechanical terms. I'm going to give you the basics. There's two elements. First, Hume says we all have a natural emotional resonance with other people. He calls this sympathy. Second, he posits an associative learning process where we create general ideas from the experience of particulars, or we associate various impressions like feelings with ideas. Over time, these combine to produce conscience. So we observe people acting in ways that benefit others, and we internalize those motives and form an ideal character. If you've read Hume, you know I'm skipping over a ton of stuff here, but I'm making a video about Hume, so check it out. Now, this ideal character of internalized motives then becomes how we judge ourselves. And so we judge our own motives by the character of the ideally just man. And when we don't measure up, well, we feel kind of icky. And that's the source of motivation for duty. I'm not a Humean, but I'll say that Hume's account here, it really is interesting, and I think it's quite serious. But there are problems. One problem, Hume's account of conscience seems to work too well. How can Hume explain how anyone ever does wrong? And MacIntyre makes a related criticism. How does Hume account for the conscience of his own ideological opponents? The conscience of the ascetic monk or the radical proto-socialist levelers? They have conscience too, but it reinforces a very different kind of life. Right? So how can Hume just dismiss their conscience? Well, MacIntyre says that implicitly, and he's doing some interpretation here, implicitly, Hume is relying on a normal conscience. But how can Hume make that kind of distinction here between a good and bad or normal and abnormal conscience without bringing in any underived moral principles? Same issue. Didn't follow the rules. Brought in something underived. An external criterion. So that distinction between normal and abnormal conscience, you can't get that from within Hume's system of emotions and sympathy, right? That's an external criterion he hasn't derived. Kant, rationality. Well, the recipes relying on the non-rational parts of the soul have failed. We've seen both desire and emotions come up short. Kant will instead try and justify the moral life through reason. As Kant sees it, all voluntary action is ultimately based in reason. We always act on some kind of principle. The question is whether that principle is aimed at satisfying an inclination for pleasure, or whether that principle is aimed at satisfying what Kant calls the moral law. So as Kant frames the issue, we have two competing ways of ordering our lives. We can order our lives around seeking pleasure or around the moral law. How do we choose which ordering? Well, Kant thinks that reason ultimately compels us to make the moral law the highest ordering principle that governs our activity. And Kant claims to have discovered that reason requires the ethical life as a matter of formal consistency. Okay, just the nature of reason. We can see this in Kant's formula of the universal law. Kant says we should only act on a principle that we can consistently will that everyone else act upon. Now, does that principle reliably separate the moral acts from the immoral? Well, many moral philosophers have doubted whether or not it does. But Kant has a second formula, the formula of humanity, that he thinks is equivalent to the first, but a lot easier to understand as moral. The formula of humanity holds that we should never treat others as a mere means to our ends, but to always treat others as ends in themselves. Now, MacIntyre will agree that the formula of humanity has genuine moral content, how he puts it. However, he doubts that the two formulas are actually equivalent, that they actually identify the same acts as right and wrong. So, for the purposes of the challenge, Kant can't rely on the formula of humanity. He has to show that it's equivalent to what he can derive simply from the formal consistency of reason. And MacIntyre judges that Kant has not carried that burden, and so he fails too. Thus, each of our three contestants has failed. Diderot tried finding the authority of morality in the desire for pleasure, but he had to appeal to an unexplained external moral criterion. Similarly, Hume tried grounding morality's authority in the passions, but he had to bring in an external moral criterion in the designation of some emotions and some consciences as normal. Well, Kant tried to ground morality's authority in formal reasoning, but he couldn't convincingly get all the right moral rules without bringing in the formula of humanity, which is an underived moral principle. So MacIntyre argues that when we add together these philosophers' individual failures to justify the ethical life, each by some particular aspect of human nature, it shows that altogether we can't justify the ethical life, at least not based on human nature as we find it. That is, not by our capacity for pleasure, not by our emotions, and not even by our reason. No appeal to observable and everyday human nature is going to cut it. So, how then can moderns justify choosing the ethical life, to live by the received moral rules? Well, if every attempt to justify the ethical life by some criteria fails, well, what else can be done? Well, now we'll see how we get from the Enlightenment failure to modern subjectivity. And MacIntyre thinks the key character who recognizes the implications of the Enlightenment's failure is Kierkegaard. So MacIntyre brings us to Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher from the early 1800s. And facing the aftermath of the Enlightenment, Kierkegaard makes what was at the time a shocking discovery about the choice to live the ethical life. It's arbitrary and entirely subjective. Kierkegaard picks up where Kant left off, the conflict between the life of pleasure and the life of principle. As MacIntyre explains Kierkegaard, he sees all of us as facing a choice between two completely opposed forms of life. We could live a life governed by the pursuit of pleasure, what Kierkegaard calls an aesthetic life. And the aesthetic life is characterized by immediacy. So the romantic lover exemplifies the character of this kind of life. Or we could live a life governed by principles, an ethical life, exemplified by marriage and its requirement for commitment. Now, we have to pick which one is going to order our lives, and we can't pick both because they're opposed. And we can call this kind of opposition, we can call it practical dualism. And as an analogy, imagine you're trying to decide how to organize your library of a few hundred books. You could organize the books by title alphabetically, or you could organize them by the author's last name. But you can't do both. Each ordering excludes the other. If you order them by title, they can't be ordered by the author's last name, and vice versa. Well, in case of these books, how would you make your decision about which ordering? Well, you'd try and figure out which ordering is more useful for you and your library. And if most of your books are by just a handful of authors, then maybe the author ordering isn't so great. So you decide to order them by title. But notice what you did. Big picture. You had a conflict between two contrary ways of ordering your library. And what'd you do to resolve it? You appealed to a higher criterion, usefulness, to make a decision. So here's where the analogy ends. As Kierkegaard understands it, we have no higher criteria by which to decide between the ethical life and the aesthetic life. So not only are they opposed, each claims to give the highest reasons for action. We have no further kind of reason to appeal to make our decision between them. So look, I can't say, well, the life of pleasure is obviously better because it's more fun. Because fun is already contained within the kinds of reasons the life of pleasure offers. I could only choose on the basis of fun if I've already decided that pleasure furnishes the highest reasons. Similarly, I can't say, well, the ethical life is better because it's the right way to live. Because then I'm justifying the ethical life by an ethical reason. So in other words, I haven't justified the ethical life, I've merely assumed it. So as MacIntyre puts it, we can't make this choice based on reasons because this is a decision about what is to count as a reason, right? Now, the way MacIntyre interprets Kierkegaard, and by the way, this is controversial, but the way he interprets Kierkegaard is he sees this dualism as irresolvable. There's no criterion outside of both the aesthetic life and the ethical life that we could use to choose between them. So Kierkegaard thinks we must simply choose. Such a choice is criterionless. It's not based on any reason, which means it's arbitrary, and which means it's rooted in subjectivity. So the idea that the ethical life cannot be rationally vindicated, but simply must be chosen subjectively, it was shocking in Kierkegaard's time. But look around. Look how comfortable people have become with it today. All right, so closing thoughts. So that's where the Enlightenment takes us. We don't get replacement foundations for the ethical life. So human telos, divine revelation, nope, those foundations are gone. Sorry. Given the Enlightenment At best, we view the ethical life and happy life as opposed, a view called practical dualism. And if that's the framework we're operating in, there's no rational resolution to their inconsistency. Now, I'll tell you, plenty of moral philosophers today are still trying to solve this problem the Enlightenment created on the terms of the Enlightenment, but I don't think any have succeeded. So I should say that from the perspective of much of academic philosophy, we haven't really moved on from the Enlightenment. We're kind of doomed to repeat the same failed arguments of Hume and Kant. But notice that elite and intellectual culture, and increasingly mass culture in the modern West, they've given up. Values are seen as subjective. Finally, notice the remaining enclaves where belief in objective or transcendent good tends to remain strong among religious people, especially Christians, who haven't been completely modernized. And this is because, through the Bible, which is an ancient document, and church tradition, which has a foot in that pre-modern world, there are sources that go beyond the Enlightenment and can still draw upon these older foundations. So for these religious communities, the foundations of human telos and divine revelation, they're still at work. Now, there's plenty more to cover about how we got here and where to go. So if you're interested in learning more, hit subscribe and check out the next video.